I've honestly wanted to do a topic on that because I'm interested in the local part because I don't know much about it.
Yeah, well, if you need anything, let me know. I don't know everything, but I know enough to make me dangerous.
That can be one of our topics this week. What Amory knows enough that makes her dangerous.
It's a lot of things. All right, and we're officially live.
Awesome. Give it a minute to get on the Mosby page and the Loudoun Museum page. And
that's right. I'll get that going.
If you guys Jeff, how have you been since our last History on Tap? You're back by public demand.
Yeah, this is a first. This is a History on Tap.
Speechless.
I got nothing. I'm deeply honored to be included in your illustrious company. Cheers to that.
Yeah, it could be depressing in some of the stories, so we need some things to cheers tonight, probably.
I don't know. I think it's interesting. I think spiritualism and seances are ultimately about hope. So I think it's super optimistic and upbeat.
That's something that I noticed too, is there's definitely a subset of people that go to seances wanting to get the spine tingles. You know, they want to be scared, but there's a real earnest current there where they want to be relating to people beyond the veil, you know, and they're not afraid of it.
For sure.
Yeah, and it definitely does fit in with a lot with our first episode on folklore too.
Yeah.
Everything I've gotten.
Yeah, I agree. All right, I think we're officially good to go.
Awesome. Well, good evening, everyone. I am Joe Rizzo with the Loudoun Museum. And as I am with every week, I am joined by Anne-Marie Paquette and Travis Shaw of the Mosby Heritage Area Association. And this week, we've got a returning guest by popular demand after our folklore episode last month. We have Dr. Jeff Tolbert from Penn State Harrisburg back with us as kind of a sequel to that episode from last month. As we heard a lot of good feedback from the folklore episode, and we had even a request for an episode looked specifically at spiritualism and some religious aspects that we got into in that episode. So we thought, let's do an entire one on spiritualism, and let's bring Jeff back. So we'll go around and we'll introduce ourselves, what we're going to be talking about tonight, and what we're drinking. And as a reminder, as you're watching along, we'd love to know what you're drinking at home. So in the comments section, we've got Andrea behind the scenes watching the comments. So any questions you have, any comments, observations about the beer you're drinking, let us know. But Travis, what are you going to talk about tonight, and what are you going to drink?
So I'm going to be talking about some of the 18th century antecedents of the spiritualist movement, kind of the roots of the movement over in Europe that have some surprising ramifications right here in Virginia, and actually right here in Loudoun County. So I'm going to be doing that while drinking the cream ale from Two Silos Brewing over there in Manassas. Really cool example of adaptive reuse. They took an old dairy farm and turned it into a brewery. They preserved a lot of the old architecture there. It's got great event space, lots of restaurants and stuff. It's a really cool site.
Awesome. And Anne-Marie, what do you got drinking tonight?
So I am drinking the Vixen Irish Red, and this is from Old Busthead in Fauquier County. It is very delicious. It's a nice dark red too. And tonight I will be talking about an 1863 seance that takes place and has connections, of course, to Mary Todd Lincoln and the White House.
Awesome. And in a similar vein, I'm going to be talking about a kind of tragic story about Jane and Franklin Pierce, also relating to the White House and seances from the 1850s. And I am drinking Crazy Pills, not a reference to anyone in particular, but Crazy Pills by Solace Brewing Company here in Loudoun, a great Pilsner. So Jeff, what about you? What are you drinking, and what are you going to talk about tonight?
I'm drinking Victory's Summer Love Golden Ale. Victory is out of a Philadelphia suburb. They're really good. Check them out if you haven't. And apparently the brew pub is an awesome place to visit. I've never been, but Travis can attest. And I'm going to talk kind of briefly about some of the background of spiritualism and its connections to Swedenborgian thought, and some of the things that happened over the course of the 19th century leading up into sort of present day spiritualist practice.
Awesome. And again, if you're watching at home, let us know what you're drinking. Let us know what your comments are. And if you have any questions, just let us know, and Andrea will feed those to us during the episode. So Jeff, before we get to Travis, I know some people are kind of a bit unsure about what spiritualism is and really how it's defined. could you give us the kind of just quick bio of spiritualism in the 19th century?
Yes, although to do it, I might do something that's a little anachronistic, and I'm going to read
Go for it.
a point made on the website of the National Spiritualist Association of Churches. According to them, and this resonates with sort of central ideas that were circulating during the 19th century, although it was less centralized than this might suggest. But they gloss spiritualism as the science, philosophy, and religion of continuous life based upon the demonstrated fact of communication by means of mediumship with those who live in the spirit world. And although, again, this is kind of an anachronistic definition, I think it is a good starting place for a discussion of all of this stuff tonight.
Sounds good. And Travis, you mentioned Swedenborg. Do you want to get us kickstarted here?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to start us off a long way from Virginia. Started in Stockholm, Sweden, 1688, with the birth of Emanuel Swedenborg, kind of the great-great-grandfather of spiritualism in a lot of ways. Born into a prominent family, his father's a bishop and a theologian, which I think has a lot of effect on his thinking as time goes on. But at least early in his life, he kind of comes out as one of these prototypical Enlightenment era polymath types. You know, he's into everything. He's studying physics, he's studying philosophy, biology, he's writing poetry. But by the 1730s, he gets very, very into the study of anatomy, and particularly the development and use of the nervous system. And this is like why I think Swedenborg is probably like some sort of time traveling alien or something like that. Because a lot of the stuff that he posits in the 1730s, it turns out like, you know, decades or hundreds of years later, like we actually find out through science is true. It's like he's like the first person to kind of identify the neuron and the function of the neuron in the brain, even though like he doesn't have the scientific equipment to test this out. He theorizes what neurons do and how they transmit thought. He correctly figures out the function of the cerebral cortex, again, without being able to like back it up with any science. He's just theorizing this stuff. The organization of the nervous system, I'm going to get this word wrong, somatopy, which is the idea that like different parts of the brain are responsible for different senses and controls of different systems. You know, that there's a point on your brain that controls smell. There's a point on your brain that controls hearing. Like he figures all this out and theorizes all this in the 1730s. So not only is he kind of the great grandfather of spiritualism, but also like a lot of modern neuroscience, which is weird. But a lot of this study of the brain and the nervous system leads him down the road to looking at the soul. You know, where does the soul or the spirit fit into all of this? Is this an anatomical function? Or is it something higher, something different? How can science figure out the connection between the two? So around this time, you know, it's like the 1740s, he's studying in the Netherlands. He's actually working on a book about the animal kingdom. And he starts having dreams. He starts having really, really weird dreams.
Like pandemic anxiety dreams like everybody's having?
Well, some of them apparently were like, the word they use is pleasurable, and some of them were terrifying. So like, I don't know, make of that what you will. So he starts having these dreams, these visions, and he drops all of his work in biology and devotes himself to studying this idea of the spirit, the soul. And in 1745, he publishes the first of over a dozen books that he's going to write on this topic, the worship and love of God. And this is around the time where he claims to have encountered God. There's a weird encounter while he's eating dinner, and like later on he goes home, and when in his dream he sees the same guy that warns him during his dinner, and the guy's like, "Oh, I'm the Lord, I'm here to like explain everything to you." And through this reoccurring series of visions, beginning in the 1740s, he claims that, you know, God has revealed himself and taken him into something that he refers to as the spirit world. Now, this is kind of the first time that this idea is really floated out there, that there is a place that's not heaven, It's not hell. I mean, I guess it's kind of like limbo or purgatory. You know, there are ideas out there about this. But this is a realm where all spirits go. When you die, you know, your physical body dies, but your spirit goes on to this kind of middle ground between heaven and hell. And as I said, for the next 25 years, the rest of his life, Swedenborg is going to devote his time to studying this and revealing this to the masses. So he writes like 14 different books. You know, my favorite is The Heavenly Doctrine, which comes out in 1758, in which he claims that the Last Judgment and the Second Coming have actually occurred the previous year in 1757. They don't occur here on our physical world, they occur in the spiritual world. You know, it's, you know, heaven and hell kind of rebalancing things in the spirit world. And he actually claims to have been in the spirit world and witnessed this happening. So, you know, from 1757 on, we're living in the Second Coming. You know, you can see why this idea didn't quite go over well with a lot of the religious orthodoxy at the time. You know, the Lutheran Church in Sweden is not super thrilled about these ideas. But it gets weirder.
Ever against the pleasure dreams?
Yeah. I noticed you drank to that, Joe.
I mean, anything's better than like the anxiety dreams I have.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's in this. He claims to have visited this world of spirits that exists between heaven and hell. And he's got really cool ideas that are going on. You know, what goes on in this spirit world. You know, basically he claims this is where your judgment occurs, and it's where like kind of this false front that everyone puts up is stripped away, and the true spiritual self is revealed. And basically, like, God doesn't send anyone to heaven or hell. You send yourself in one direction or the other, depending on who you truly are. So then he gets into Earths in the universe, in which he claims to have talked to spirits from other planets, Jupiter, Mars, the moon, Saturn, as well as planets outside of our solar system. And he, you know, argues, he basically said, if God is infinitely powerful, then like, what's 10,000 worlds to a God? Like, of course it exists, and of course they're populated. And then the one that really has the greatest influence on what will become the spiritualist movement 100 years later is his book Heaven and Hell. And this is fascinating. I've spent like the last week reading this. It's basically almost like his version of Dante's Inferno. He claims to have visited heaven, the spirit world, and hell. You know, he's shown around. He gets to talk and interact with all the spirits here. You know, he
Who
talks.
shows him around?
What's that?
Who's showing him around?
God takes him there.
I like to think it's like the Hershey Park ride, where it like takes you through the factory and shows you.
Yeah, I'm sure it was something like that. But a lot of the stuff he says was like very contradictory towards like established Christian doctrine. Like he says, angels and demons aren't supernatural. They all began as people on Earth, and it was like their life on Earth that put them in one camp or the other. He also basically says that like angels and devils and stuff, like you sleep, you eat, you go to like work, you help people out. Like it's basically like life on Earth, just in a spiritual realm. And now you're starting to see like why later spiritualists in the 19th century pick up on this idea that, you know, our existence that we know of, you know, here on Earth carries over after you die in some way, shape, or form. You know, like if you're married here on Earth, like, and your marriage is great, you're going to be married to your significant other in the spirit realm. You know, it's pretty interesting stuff. But, you know, this idea that there is this spiritual limbo that we all pass through on our way to either heaven or hell is going to become very, very powerful in these later iterations. So he has all these weird ideas. He's writing all this weird stuff. Then he starts having prophecies where he's actually foretelling the future, which again, like I think this guy's some sort of time traveling alien or like quantum leap situation here. You know, for instance, in 1758, he's with the Queen of Sweden, and she asks him like to contact her brother who had just died. And he's like, yeah, sure, I'll go into the spirit realm and talk to him. And like whispers something to her, and she freaks out because it's something that only her brother and her would have known. He does a similar thing with a person who's looking for, it's like a piece of paperwork or an item that her former, one of her family members who's deceased had hidden. And he's like, yeah, no problem. I'll tell you exactly where it is. It's here. He's at a dinner party hundreds of miles from Stockholm, and he stands up in the middle of it and is like, there's a fire in Stockholm right now. It's burning everything down. And then a few hours later, he gets up and he's like, no, it's cool. It stopped just before it got to my house, so I'm fine. Sure enough, like 3 days later, when they get news from Stockholm, everything he said has been absolutely true. So he's a very strange individual, and you can kind of see why, even though what he's saying is very, very kind of dangerous ideas, at least from the church perspective, that people are listening to him. His last great prophecy, though, is he actually predicts the day that he's going to die. Like he's staying in an inn, and he tells like the landlady, he's like, yeah, I'm gonna go like on the 23rd or whatever. And sure enough, he dies on the date that he states, in 1772. So he leaves all this weird writing, this kind of amazing legacy of science and of theology and everything else, but he never intended to start a church. And it's not until about 10 years after his death that people start picking up his writings and trying to turn it into a church. And it actually gets started in England in the 1780s. We see the formation of what's known as the New Church. Now, this is going to have, as I said before I started, a very interesting ramification over here on this side of the Atlantic. Enter Robert Carter III. Robert Carter III is the great-grandson of King Carter, one of the wealthiest men to have ever lived in colonial America. Robert owns over a dozen plantations all across the state. He owns nearly 500 enslaved people. I mean, we're talking about the 1% of the 1% in Virginia. He's a counselor on the governor's council. I mean, he is in the who's who of colonial America. But in 1777, he actually almost dies of smallpox. And this is, again, one of those moments where like a switch is flipped in his brain, and he starts to kind of doubt the way he's been living. He was kind of like millionaire playboy type in his youth, and he's starting to really regret some of that. He's starting to find himself at odds with the established Anglican church that, the Virginia gentry is very much a part of. And so he starts experimenting with faith. He goes to Quaker meetings, Presbyterian meetings, settles into the Baptist church, actually, in a fairly radical Baptist congregation where there's integrated meetings, which is almost unheard of in 18th century Virginia. Not just that African Americans are allowed into the meeting, but they're actually preaching, and they're actually taking part in what's going on. So he spends about a decade in this Baptist church. And then in 1788, he meets a Mr. Moyse, who has come from Philadelphia. And Moyse introduces Robert Carter III to the works of Emanuel Swedenborg. And Carter is very much the kind of guy who would be into this. He's exploring all these different faith avenues. And he's really attracted to these kind of, more liberal churches, kind of more less dogmatic churches. So he starts consuming everything he can get his hands on about Swedenborg, which is, very little here in America. So he starts offering merchants. He's like, instead of me pay, or, instead of payment, why don't you bring me books of Swedenborg's from Europe so that I can have them in my collection. He actually starts paying a publisher in Baltimore to republish these works and distribute them. He becomes like the first apostle of the Swedenborgian church here in America, which is really, really kind of cool. He writes in his diary, he's like, he truly believes that the second coming has occurred, and like he's living it. And this is going to have a profound effect on what he does next, which I think is one of the most revolutionary and very unique things to come out of 18th century Virginia. In 1791, he submits a deed of gift to manumit the 400 odd human beings that he owns. Something that no other large planter, none of his contemporaries, we're talking about someone who hangs out with Washington and Jefferson and them.
Here's the manumission.
Yeah. He decides, against the advice of everyone he knows and like everyone's kind of better judgment, to free these people. Now, it's not quite that simple. In the 1790s, he couldn't just give all these people their freedom. The courts basically declare that it has to be staggered, so it's going to be a gradual manumission. And then his kids get involved. He's got 10 adult children. They all sue him because, of course, in their eyes, daddy is letting their
Inheritance
walk out the door. And so his children will actually bring him to lawsuit over the manumitting of these people. And so it actually takes so long that some of the older enslaved people actually die before they receive their freedom, which, you know, is kind of one of the cruelest ironies of this. But in the end, over 400 people, nearly 500 people receive their freedom as a result of this. And it becomes the largest private manumission in American history. Pretty much the biggest mass emancipation up until the Civil War. It's a remarkable moment. And he's not popular for it. His kids hate him, his neighbors hate him, his contemporaries, all these other Virginia planters hate him because they're like, you've just done something stupid and dangerous. You've given these people, you know, hope that they can be free too. So he actually leaves Nominee Hall, he leaves the Carter family plantation and moves to Baltimore to basically devote himself to the Swedenborgian community there, and will live the rest of his life up until 1804 in Baltimore, attending Swedenborgian services, getting works published, and really, you know, carrying on this conversion. And the reason why I love the story now is it's so unique, but one of his children, one of his sons that actually brings the suit against him is George Carter, who will go on to build Oatlands Plantation just south of Leesburg. He inherits the land from his father, but he does not inherit any enslaved people. So through the 19th century, he and later his wife, Elizabeth Carter, will actually, you know, purchase people to work at Oatlands, enslave people. And by the time of the Civil War, it is the largest slave plantation in Loudoun County, which is, again, kind of a weird legacy to have when your father has done this, you know, mass emancipation and you've gone back on that. And all because of, you know, someone happened to introduce him to the works of Emanuel Swedenborg. And just as like last little aside, the Swedenborgian church is still a thing. There's like maybe 10,000 adherents in the world today. There's a congregation in Washington, D.C., one up near Philadelphia. So this legacy is still very much out there, which I find fascinating. Of course, the other legacy is how it feeds into 19th century spiritualism. And so I think, Jeff, you were going to kind of bridge the gap there for us. Oh,
hold on a second.
Yeah.
A lot of fascinating things there. But I wonder if, like, Elizabeth, I mean, she's very pro-Confederacy. I wonder if, like, a lot of these things with the Carter family are a reaction to what he did.
I absolutely think so. You know, the lawsuits within the family are very acrimonious. And, you know, Robert Carter III is absolutely convinced that he has done the right thing. You know, he has done what he has to be a good man. His children do not see it that way in the slightest. You know, we know that, you know, Oatlands, they start building around 1804, the same year that Robert III dies. By 1810, George Carter has already purchased more, you know, he's already purchased, I think, 12 or 15 slaves to begin reestablishing himself as a planter.
Yeah, and Travis, we got a couple of questions that have come in. We got a couple, like one, Peter wants to know if Swedenborg was religious when he was growing up. Do you know much about his childhood?
I know a little about his childhood. So he seems to have been very interested in religion. His father was actually a Lutheran bishop in Sweden. So he grew up around this. And then his father is actually offered the chair of theology at Uppsala University there. So he grows up very much part of this Lutheran tradition. He actually writes one of his works, and I wrote the name of it down, somewhere in here, The True Christian Religion. He actually writes that as like an explanation to the Lutheran Church, like, this is how my teachings kind of play into what you guys are talking about. Like, he's trying to kind of almost say, you know, it's not really that radical. I'm just taking the ideas I learned here and, you know, adding in what has been revealed to me. So it does seem that he did have a very, very religious, you know, very well versed in religion as a young man.
Yeah, and we got another question too, and Jeff, maybe you can help with this one. So Jake wants to know, like really how this fits within other philosophies of the Enlightenment period that are challenging Christian norms. I mean, of course, Enlightenment is challenging itself. How this fits within it, though, particularly though, Jeff, is that something you could speak to?
Well, I don't know about challenging Christian norms necessarily, although one of the figures that I'll talk about in a minute was kind of explicitly anti-clerical, but not anti-Christian, importantly. But there certainly were other forms of thinking that were kind of emerging in the decades following Swedenborg that came to have an influence on this emerging movement of spiritualism, including mesmerism, which folks may or may not have heard of, as well as perhaps surprisingly phrenology, the belief that patterns and bumps on the human skull can reveal things about people's behaviors and character, and that through massage or manipulation you could have an impact on the development of people's character. You could actually change behaviors by massaging the skull in particular way. Yeah, I know, right? Everybody's doing it right now.
So this is interesting, and I'm not a religious history expert by any stretch of the means, but it's interesting because it seems as though at the same time you are having these religious experiences, you also have, you have the philosophers, you have humanism, you have deism appearing. So they kind of seem to be pulling in opposite directions. One saying we are closer to the spirit world than ever, we are closer to God, to the afterlife than ever, and the other half saying, you know what it is, and we should just worry about what's happening here on earth. Is that accurate?
One of the great kind of paradoxes of the Enlightenment, we like to think of it as like this very super rational, very scientific movement, moving away from religion. But at the same time, some of the greatest philosophical thinkers of the Enlightenment are very based in that. You look at a lot of the scientific work being done by the Jesuits in the 18th century. You look at, people like Wesley, who was a correspondent of Swedenborg, and goes on to found the Methodist Church. These people, as Jeff said, I think that was a great point you make. You can be anti-clerical without being anti-Christian, or you can be rational while still being religious. Robert Carr III is a good example. He flirted with deism, was actually considered himself a deist for quite some time before coming across Swedenborg. So, religion is not necessarily a countercurrent to what's going on in the Enlightenment. Not necessarily. There certainly are anti-religious elements to it, but I would say it's just as easy to find plenty of religious elements that are going on at the same time.
Mm-hmm. And that all of that is definitely reflected in the burgeoning spiritualist movement. Simultaneously, a concern with rationalism and what might later be termed empiricism, but also personal experience of the transcendent or the divine. All of these different intellectual currents kind of coming together in ways that don't always maybe make sense from a contemporary perspective, but which people were able to kind of fuse through the lens of personal experience. One of the most important figures of 19th century spiritualism was a guy named Andrew Jackson Davis, also known as the Seer of Poughkeepsie, who had a vision in 1844 in which he encountered not only the ancient Greek Dr. Galen, but also none other than Emanuel Swedenborg himself, who proclaimed himself in vision to be Davis's sort of special teacher in understanding sort of how to commune with spirits and developing himself spiritually. Davis would go on to have a short-lived spiritualist newspaper out of New York City that was very influential. And by the time the infamous Fox sisters of Hydesville, New York kind of hit the scene in a really big way in 1848, Davis had really established himself as a major presence in American spiritualism. He would come to advocate for what he saw or what he labeled as philosophical spiritualism, which he kind of contrasted with the seance spiritualism that the Fox sisters would sort of popularize. So the Fox sisters are these initially two and later joined by a third sister from a small town called Hydesville in New York. who claimed that they were receiving spiritual communications from someone whom they eventually identified as a murdered peddler whose remains were buried in their basement. They would eventually be invited to New York by Jackson Davis himself, and they would start a tour of seances for which they charged admission, about I think it was $1 per person, which was not an inconsiderable sum in the 1840s. Down the line, 2 of the 3 Fox sisters kind of got involved with alcohol and living kind of increasingly risque lifestyles, and would eventually admit that they had faked the spiritual wrappings through which they were supposedly receiving these communications. But by that time, spiritualism was so well established on the scene that their acknowledgement of their own fraud really didn't derail the movement at all. But Davis was an interesting figure, though, in that his influences were very explicitly not only Swedenborgian, but also phrenological. Again, you know, a concern with aspects of the skull and the brain and the sort of sensorium of humans as being connected in a direct way to the spirit or the soul, and also to mesmerism, the idea that all of creation existed in a kind of divine fluid, and relations between humans and other kinds of beings could be controlled through magnetic currents and things of that nature, and through inducing a kind of trance state in people through the use of magnets, all kinds of interesting effects could be achieved. So all of that together was kind of wrapped up in Davis's approach to spiritualism. At first, Davis was kind of on board with the more immediate experiential form of spiritualism that the Fox sisters kind of pioneered. And that took what are probably to us more familiar forms today. So their kinds of seances would involve things like rapping, you know, the communications through loud noises, table tipping when everyone is gathered at a seance, sitting around the table, you know, and the table starts moving on its own. Drawing and writing mediums. So automatic writing was an important part of spiritualism at this point. So a spirit would possess the medium a person felt to be sensitive, and they would, not under their own volition, they would write out messages received from the spirit world. Trance speakers, people who would speak under the control of a spirit, and other kinds of mediums as well, including people who could specifically see the spirits that were present among them. This is all, by the way. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say it's interesting, Davis's experience, because it's similar, although of course earlier than another individual, Jesse Babcock Ferguson, who had I came across him because for a brief time he actually lived and went to school in Frederick County, Virginia, later split into Clark and Frederick counties. But he had a similar path where he actually started at a school teaching with the Presbyterian Mission Society, became a pastor himself, and then started dabbling in both mesmerism and phrenology. And then, so when spiritualism came more into the public in the early 1850s, he attends one of these public seances in Ohio, and then it just so happens that his wife and daughter become mediums. Conveniently, you know, kind of a thing. But it's interesting because he's actually later in life, he's in Nashville, and so we see the same thing. A lot of this starts in New York, you know, starts in New England, but then we see it kind of trickling as these public seances gain followings in different areas. And in addition to his wife and daughter, at one point he's working with an enslaved person who doesn't know how to read or write, but is channeling these spirit writings and spirit drawings. Which is just an interesting kind of mirror version, you know, in Southern culture and what we see going on down there.
Well, that's really fascinating. Yeah, and, among the things that you pointed to with your example are this democratizing impulse that folks have noted regarding spiritualism, and especially a kind of egalitarian ethos, in that mediums were a lot more often than not women rather than men. There were male mediums as well, but there was a preponderance of women who adopted or who came into the role of mediums, which is really significant at this moment in history. And there was also kind of an explicit cultivation of social justice causes and
Yes.
awareness of them. That
Well, and that was something that I was, because I've seen a couple of different writers hint towards this, the idea that because spiritualism first took root in America in New England, of course, the Fox sisters, one of the first individuals to give them a boost into popularity, into doing a public talk, is a very strongly Quaker woman, Quaker family that are neighbors of theirs. So you automatically see their brand of spiritualism being colored by the Quaker communities in New England, and elsewhere you might see that too. The idea that it's about abolitionism gets tied up in this a lot. Equal rights or equal-ish rights for women, gets wrapped up in this.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Yeah, I skipped over the Quaker connection, but after the initial rappings in Hydesville, the Fox sisters moved to Rochester, and just as you say, they were welcomed by the Quaker community there. And Catherine Albanese is an important historian of American religions, and she sees Quakerism and specifically shaking Quakers or the Shakers as kind of the an intermediate step, I guess, in between the 18th century things Travis was talking about and the more fully developed seance spiritualism that would come later. So I think you're exactly right to note that Quaker connection. That's very important.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's no coincidence that, like I said, Carter becomes very much enmeshed in Quaker communities as well, and Swedenborg is not just like doing his own thing, but he's also super interested in kind of the Lutheran pietist movements, which we have a lot of in America. We've got Moravians and Dunkards and Mennonites and stuff, and as you said, the Shaker community. These ideas are out there, and I guess really kind of crystallized in the 1840s, 1850s.
So of course that kind of brings us into Doe's point that by the 1850s, spiritualism is a popular phenomenon, regardless of your own religious background. It's a thing.
Yeah, and actually just going off your point too, I mean, these social reform movements, they are becoming mainstream. So maybe it's not so out of line that we normally think, because with the Second Great Awakening, it is more egalitarian. It is kind of taking away the stature of the more traditional pastor and preacher, and giving them really the hands in the people, that they can control their own destiny, that emotionalism can get involved. And it does fit within a lot of social movements that you then see coming from the antebellum period. So maybe it's not so out of line that sometimes maybe we think looking back too.
Definitely. And spiritualist thinking and practice were kind of shunted very directly into subsequent movements after the Civil War, like including Theosophy and New Thought, and carried right through into the present in the New Age movement. And spiritualism itself, similar to Swedenborgianism, continues to actually have an explicit presence today, which is interesting. There's most famously probably is the Lily Dale Assembly in Lily Dale, New York, which is a spiritualist commune that still exists today. They have a website that lists registered mediums who live in the community and the services that they offer. And it's a really, really interesting place. I've unfortunately never been myself. I can't wait to go. Really hoping to visit one day.
Yeah, and the story I've got too, I think also again shows that they don't always compete with each other, where people deeply religious turn to spiritualism, for what's going on in their lives. Before I get into my story, I just want to make a quick toast to your health, to Memorial Day, something cheerful, because the story I'm going to tell is very depressing. So
Doesn't get dark. Pleasurable dreams.
So cheers to a good weekend ahead.
I need a new beer. Right back.
Jeff's out of here.
To divine revelations.
Yeah, and like any other episodes, we've talked about how, like, as all historians do, you go down certain rabbit holes where you start researching one thing, it leads down a whole nother road. The story I'm going to tell is like the OG rabbit hole for me. Like, it is the #1 rabbit hole. Where like back in high school when I started, getting involved in history, I came across Franklin Pierce and his wife and their story. It then led to multiple undergraduate research papers, then graduate ones, and ultimately led to my dissertation. So it's been like years, kind of the story, and different factors the story came about. But I want to talk about Franklin Pierce and Jane Pierce. They're complete opposites, really in every, I mean, they're married, but they're complete opposites besides the fact that they're married together. Jane is sickly. She's very introverted, deeply religious. Her father was a minister, an elite New England family, very just frail, very just closed off. Franklin Pierce, conversely, is very social, extroverted, really charismatic, really opposite in Jane in every way. Jane,
Heavy drinker.
well, yeah, so Jane is leaning towards abolition, and she's a temperance movement person. Franklin Pierce is very defensible of slavery, and also in a lot of stages of life a complete drunk. So again, like there's like incompatibility with these two in their entire lives. Another difference between the two is that Jane abhors politics, and that's what drives Franklin Pierce, is his own personal desire in politics. So despite that, these two honestly really do care for each other. Particularly Franklin Pierce is always worried about Jane, her health, and her well-being. But there's two very different people. And that complete difference of opinions on public life causes problems throughout their entire marriage. And Franklin Pierce is a congressman from New Hampshire. He is a senator for a period of time. But Jane hates Washington, D.C. She hates the culture of Washington, D.C., ultimately convinces him to retire from public office. They've also around this time had a couple tragedies. Their first son dies in infancy, and their other son dies, I think, at 4 years old from fever. So they've had a lot of sad news in their lives up to this point, and Jane does not want to be a part of the public life. They do have a third son, Benny Pierce, who survives infancy. To Jane's frustration, though, Franklin Pierce, still not wanting to give up some sort of public life, does volunteer in the Mexican War. He's a general in the war, comes back, survives it, and post-Mexican War period, it's probably the best part of their lives. Franklin Pierce works on his law practice. Jane Pierce devotes all her attention to her son, Benny. She makes sure that he has a strong evangelical upbringing, and really their whole world surrounds Benny Pierce. And I'll share my screen so you can see a picture of Jane and her son. So that's Benny, I think, a little bit before he was 10 years old. That's Jane Pierce.
It's really a beautiful photo.
It is. I mean, even in her face. I mean, in photos where you always look, I mean, they're just like stone cold looking ahead of you. In photos, this is one where you can kind of feel the realness of it.
Yeah, it's very tender.
So again, life is going pretty well for them, and kind of Pierce being out of the spotlight. He hides it from her, but he is still trying to vie for some sort of political offices if one came about. And when the Democrats were looking for basically a candidate in 1852 that didn't have a lot of baggage, a dark horse emerged, and it was Franklin Pierce. He really didn't have a lot of enemies because he hadn't really done much, but he was a war hero and did have some experience. So behind the scenes, he put his name out there unbeknownst to Jane. And when he does, after several ballots in the convention, he does get the Democratic nomination. And they were actually out for a carriage ride when they heard the news. And Jane literally fainted when she heard that Franklin was going to be the Democratic nominee. And she was distraught by this news. She hated Washington. She didn't want to go back. Franklin tries to basically say it's going to be okay, because what this will do is open a lot of doors for them to help Benny succeed down the road. Him being president will help their son. She doesn't really buy it. She makes it known that she is praying every day that he loses this election. Benny also doesn't want him to win, actually writes a note to his mother from school saying, "I hope he won't be elected, for I should not like to be at Washington, and I know you would not either." So again, Franklin's got his wife and his son hoping that he loses this election. He wins in a landslide. So, I'm not going to get into all the reasons why he wins, but he does win. So then, disappointingly, Jane gets ready to move the family to Washington, D.C. As he was president-elect, they spend New Year's in Boston, Massachusetts. And they end up staying a little bit longer than they anticipated because of a funeral that happens in early January. But on January 6th, 1853, they board a train to go back to Concord to get ready to move to the White House. And not much more than a mile as this train is going, there's a train derailment. There's like a jar and a snap, and the train car that they're in derails and goes down an embankment. So people are thrown. Franklin and Jane really don't have any wounds from it. There is one fatality that comes from this crash, and it's Benny Pierce, who was crushed by the wreckage. In a horrific way. He's partly decapitated in the back of his head. And when they're looking for him, Franklin can't stop Jane from seeing the corpse. While they're looking, they both see him. Franklin quickly moves her away so she doesn't look at it. And as you can, of course, imagine, this is a sight that they will never forget, and it changes their life forever. They are thrown into utter grief over losing to the son that they've poured all their life into. And they both go down spiritual paths to try to find some sort of justification for why this happened. For Franklin, he looks at his past drinking, his past politics, his sins that he had done, as maybe this was retribution from God for why God took Benny. And this changes his life completely. It's going to really impact his presidency and the decisions he makes, his state of mind during it. And he's just really not ever quite the same person. For Jane Pierce, she'll never recover from this, and she never really leaves mourning Benny Pierce. And when she looks at God for this, she really dives deeply into this Calvinistic mindset. And then she also thinks that God took Benny because Franklin was elected president, that God wanted to remove all distractions from Franklin Pierce as he was in public office. And since Benny was such a part of their life, he had to take Benny away as a sacrifice to the country so Franklin Pierce wouldn't have any distractions as president. So welcome to the office. He becomes president, after this horrific thing. I mean, she skips his inauguration. She is obviously in mourning when he takes office, but will stay in mourning. She doesn't take part in any social functions at the White House. A couple other ladies kind of step in for the social obligations of the position. And Jane Pierce, for the most part, stays in her private room in the White House. Doesn't speak to many people except for some close friends and some relatives that occasionally visit. Her and Franklin have different rooms. So he's really a widower in a lot of ways. And while she's in her room, again, she looks towards spiritualism. And one of the ways that she does is through writing letters to her deceased son, Benny. These just terribly sad letters that she sits up there writing, asking that he comes and visits her, his spirit at least, comes and visits her so she can apologize for not expressing her love enough, and just express her love for him and her apologies to him. Like in one of the letters, for example, she writes, "I know not how to go on without you. You were my comfort, dear, far more than you ever thought." So she wants him to visit her so she can apologize for not expressing that love enough when he was alive. And in addition to those letters, she has seances at the White House. And Jeff, you mentioned the Fox sisters in the 1840s who come to prominence. They come to the White House and they hold seances with Jane in an attempt to try to bring Benny back so she can reconnect with her son spiritually. And, I don't know if it's the seances, if it's the dreams, or at least I could say the letters she writes, but she does have dreams, and she has successive dreams where Benny does come back to her, which helps her somewhat go, put her mind at ease. And by 1855, really in the last year of Pierce's presidency, she does start to come out in some capacity for some social events. But she's always going to be in mourning attire from this point forward. Her health, mentally and physically, declines after Benny's death. She eventually dies from tuberculosis in her 50s. But for someone like her, raised, by a minister, deeply evangelical, deeply religious, pours herself into religion. Pierce too, like Franklin also, they become devout Christians during this time. They have a strict policy on doing work on the Sabbath. They go multiple times to church a week, finding comfort in that. But then you also get Jane, again, thinking that writing letters to her deceased son and bringing people like the Fox sisters to the White House will somehow bring his spirit back so she can kind of sort of make amends to it.
Yeah, that's heavy stuff.
Yeah, this is a question I asked Jeff the other night, I think, was, how do you reconcile this kind of religious orthodoxy, like, your Christian religion with spiritualism? Like, how do you do that?
Well, I mean, for Christian churches, the idea of being able to interact with loved ones from beyond the grave is not antithetical to the Bible, is not antithetical to plenty of churches. I mean, Elijah is visited by Elisha, and there are plenty of biblical examples of being connected to. And I think one of the interesting points about spiritualism in this time is that you have people who are obviously adhering to more traditional forms of faith, and this is a kind of like extracurricular faith activity, right? Like it's not given the automatic, no from a lot of churches.
Yeah, and one thing I've been curious too is that, what do people who aren't in grief and also deeply religious thinking about this? I mean, when people are grieving, they look for any sort of means to comfort themselves. Is this just a plea, desperation where they think, I can do this and it doesn't go against my religion? Are other people who kind of aren't in that sad state, are they just kind of viewing this as a joke or an amusement? That's, Jeff, do you know?
Critics of spiritualism definitely viewed it as laughable at best and dangerous at worst. Proponents from within spiritualism, though, in more cases than not, I think saw it as, if not explicitly Christian, then at least connected in an important way to Christianity and growing out of the truths of Judeo-Christian religions. There's a sense of I was just looking over the list here of definitions of spiritualism on the official website. And for one thing, they say spiritualism is a religion because it strives to understand and to comply with the physical, mental, and spiritual laws of nature, which are the laws of God. So in common with a lot of movements coming out, particularly coming out of the burned over district in New York in the mid 19th century, but other innovations in American Christianities during that time, there's this emphasis on personal experience, on personal access to the divine as something that is attainable to all and not necessarily requires mediation through the institution of established Christian denominations. So I mentioned before that Andrew Jackson Davis was explicitly anti-clerical but not anti-Christian. And some developers of spiritualism would introduce distinctly Gnostic elements into spiritualist practice, in that part of the goal was to become Christ-like in oneself by developing natural abilities that God had given all members of creation. So there's a strange tension, I suppose, between insiders who see it in this democratizing, accessible, experiential way. Your example, Joe, of the Pierces and their attempts to communicate with their deceased son as a way of not only overcoming grief, but actually taking the reins of one's own spiritual experience in a very direct way. And on the other hand, people who saw it as, little more than parlor tricks. And increasingly after the Civil War, the things that would happen at seances became more and more dramatic. Catherine Albanese, in her book, A Republic of Mind and Spirit, talks about a guitar flying through the air and magically playing itself, and other kinds of things that happened at seances that might be perceived as outlandish to people. People out. I was wondering when the banjo was going to come back. That might be seen as weird, by people outside of the tradition, but in the context of seance situations, they had really deep meanings for the participants. And it's easy for us to point to the fact that the Fox sisters charged for their seances, for example, as something that might cast suspicion on it. But it nevertheless had important functions in the lives of the participants, and it received a lot of careful thought by those participants. There was an interesting case in New Orleans. A historian named Melissa Daggett recently published work a few years back called Spiritualism in 19th Century New Orleans, The Life and Times of Henri Louis Rey. Henri Louis Rey was a freedman of color who became the leader of the Cercle Harmonique in New Orleans in the years prior to the Civil War. During the Civil War, he served first as a Confederate soldier, and then later, when he realized that was not a good place to be for a freed man of color, he went over and became a member of the Union Native Guards and kept detailed records of the seance sittings that he and his group did for a period of almost 20 years. So although there can be a perception from outside that spiritualist practices are, again, strange, to put it mildly, they have come in a lot of ways to be important, not only for individuals who are going through periods of loss or trauma or tragedy, but also for people who might be disempowered in other ways. And we mentioned before the role of women as mediums, and here at least is one instance of a freed man of color being a medium and a spiritual leader in his community. So it's always a balancing act between our sort of presentist views on spiritual practices that don't necessarily align with our own, and trying to understand the feelings and experiences of the participants themselves.
And of course, during the Civil War, millions of people are experiencing forms of grief, and the White House is not immune from that too. Neither is the First Family. So, Jane Pierce, the first one to have seances, she's not the only one. So Anne-Marie, Mary Todd has a history of this, right?
Yeah, she does. Thanks, Joe. So as many people know, actually Mary Todd and Mr. Abraham Lincoln, their family life echoes the Pierces in at least one unfortunate way. That's the fact that they lose children. Of course, Eddie dies young before the family even comes to Washington, D.C. But then in 1862, young Willie Lincoln, again at the age of 11, so a similar age to Benny Pierce, Willie dies of typhoid fever. And this just wrecks Mary Todd, who was already given to being an emotional person, sometimes seen as a temperamental person, and she goes into mourning for a long time. But very soon after Willie dies, she's communicating with mediums to come to the White House to help her get in touch with her deceased son. And so we know that there are several seances going on, not just in the White House, but also at the soldiers' home, which is where the Lincolns have where they stay in the summertime. And there are a couple of individuals who keep popping up as kind of trusted mediums of the Lincoln family. And one of those individuals is Charles Colchester, who calls himself Lord Colchester and insists that he's an illegitimate son of an English lord who is now, slumming it in Washington, D.C., hanging out with the president.
Hanging out with ghosts,
Hanging out with ghosts, hanging out with the president. It's what you do. And so Colchester sat for a number of seances with Mrs. Lincoln in the Red Room of the White House. And Lincoln had apparently sat in on one of these seances. It's not clear what exactly Abraham thought about the whole thing, but most historians agree that he was skeptical of the person, was most likely attending the seances to keep an eye on Mary more than, to satisfy his own mourning. He was dealing with it in his own way. And so Mary, being someone who was still reasonable enough to know the public opinion of seances and what it would mean if people knew that the First Lady was doing this, she actually asked a friend of theirs, Noah Brooks, to sit in on a seance to be her kind of chaperone, just to keep an eye on things, to suss out if there's some tomfoolery going on. Noah Brooks is a journalist at this time. He's working with the Sacramento Union paper, but he had known the Lincolns from back in Illinois in the 50s. And it's interesting that she asks him to sit in because Noah's wife had just died, also in 1862. So I believe that she's picking someone who understands the desire to connect with someone from the other side, and someone who might be interested in participating in their own right. Noah Brooks actually declines Mrs. Lincoln's invitation to come to the seance at the soldier's home. However, very shortly after that, he's invited by a third party to attend one of Colchester's seances in that guy's private home. You still have to charge for seances in a private home. So Noah Brooks pays the $1 fee and goes to this gentleman's home.
On the mediums, you must, a small.
You must. Yeah, you pass the hat. So Noah Brooks pays the fee and he goes to this man's home. Like, they're open-minded, but decidedly not, not really, not convinced by any stretch of the means. And so typically at a private seance, what you would have is people seated around a table, usually the dining table, however many people are there, and they would all hold hands and they would turn out the lights. And it's at that point that someone might prompt the medium with questions to answer, and thus the communications would begin. So they're sitting there, they're in the dark, they're holding hands. And for Colchester's, this particular seance, he had placed on the table a banjo, a bell, and a drum. That very banjo, the Travis Shaw banjo story. So a banjo or a guitar, a bell, and a drum are on the table. Everyone is holding hands. And when the lights are off, the instruments begin playing themselves. Noah Brooks, being a skeptic, he surreptitiously throws off the hands of the people that he's holding hands with and just blindly grabs at the table, trying to discover what the root of the playing is. And he grabs an arm. And so it's dark. He's grabbed this arm. He's shouting, "Someone strike a light! Someone strike a light!" Between him grabbing the arm and the light turned on, someone bashes him in the head with the drum. Then the match is struck, and he's revealed he's holding both of Colchester's arms, one holding the bell and one holding the drum. So Colchester is publicly disgraced, at least in terms of this private seance.
That's not a good look.
No, it's not a good look. And in the hubbub, everyone is shouting and going on about Colchester, like, makes a quick exit without being noticed. So Colchester slinks away. And Noah Brooks is able to go and report back to Mary Todd Lincoln, this guy's full of crap. He is.
Hey, I'm impressed that he could play all those instruments. I mean, I'm.
Ding-a-ling, ding-a-ling, ding-a-ling. Yeah. I don't know that there was any symphony going on during the seance, but there was at least some strumming and some banging. So Brooks goes to Mary Todd and is like, he's not legit. You need to cut him off. Well, when Mary Todd and Colchester next speak, Colchester threatens to blackmail Mrs. Lincoln, saying if you don't, he wants a ticket to New York. He wants, something paid for him to go on to his next place. And he says, if you don't give me this, I will tell everyone that I've been doing seances for you. Because it's still, you keep it on the down low. And she's horrified and goes to her buddy, Noah Brooks. Well, Noah Brooks shows up, and it's pure drama TV. He goes up to Colchester, and Colchester doesn't recognize him. But then Noah Brooks is like, "Do you remember me?" And he pushes back his hair, revealing the cut from the drum.
Whoa.
From the seance, and is like, he says, "You are I think he says scalawag. You're a scalawag and a humbug. And if you ever show yourself around here again,"
in the 19th century.
Yes,
I will
he
drink
goes,
to that.
You humbug.
"A scallywag and a humbug. And if you stick around DC, it's gonna be in the old Capitol prison." Boom.
Yeah, total mic drop moment. Jesus.
Total mic drop moment.
Wow.
And so that's how Lord Colchester ended up making his exit from Washington, D.C. So after that
Very
point,
well told.
Thank you. That seance was in the summer of 1863. And shortly after that, Mrs. Lincoln kind of loses her taste for seances, but she'll still meet with a couple of mediums, over the next couple of years. And she of course maintains that she can connect with Willie. And later she has a similar reaction to when Abraham Lincoln is of course shot and killed. She says that after these seances, she had actually seen Willie come stand at her bedside at the foot of her bed and would smile sweetly at her and would sometimes even bring his younger brother Eddie with him too. And for her, this was a very positive experience.
Yeah.
Which is great, but most people having a smiling ghost child at the foot of your bed would be terrifying. And then of course, after Abraham Lincoln's death, she goes to New England and actually has a photo taken by William Mumler, with a spirit photo taken with the ghost of Abraham Lincoln, and Joe actually has that photo as well. So William Mumler was known for doing these spirit photographs, and again, we see this being kind of like spooky kitsch, but for people getting these photographs done, they were reassuring, they were positive, you know, examples of your loved one still being close to you. Thanks, Joe.
That's great.
But I thought that seance story was just too cool
That's
for
awesome.
school, and no approach
That's
being the
brilliant.
hero who brings it down. Interestingly, there are some records of Colchester, Lord Colchester, often warning Abraham Lincoln to be careful of his life, you know, to be on guard because there are forces out there that want to kill him. A lot of people were telling Lincoln
Yeah,
this.
I was gonna say that's like a no-brainer.
You're a president and there's a war. Yeah, people want you dead. And apparently Lincoln actually references that at some point too, where someone else is saying like, oh, they're trying to kill you. And Lincoln's like, yeah, Colchester said so too, you know, just kind of as an offhand. But then I came across one article, it was written in the Smithsonian magazine, that suggested that the Lord Charles Colchester was at the time of the assassination. Charles Colchester may have been staying at the same hotel as John Wilkes Booth, and there were a couple of just very loosey-goosey connections that they may have been socially not working together, but maybe socially acquainted. So that's a mystery for another time.
I feel like we could start a pretty good conspiracy theory right now on that.
Yeah, probably.
It's
Connections
interesting how all
between
these
spiritualism
have,
and the Illuminati, and
Yeah.
And Lord
The
Colchester,
Swedenborgians.
all, yeah,
Yeah.
Swedenborgian.
Lord Colchester.
all three.
Well, I mean, if we could just feel his skull, we could figure out what was going on.
and we could massage it so that he would make better life decisions.
Make better choices.
It's weird how all these stories involve dreams too. And again, I don't know any of the history about dreams and the psyche, but I don't know like how they see dreams as a spiritual or religious thing, Jeff? Do you know? Or because obviously they don't know about how it's like kind of a retention function of the brain. Do you know how 19th century views of how dreams work?
Oh, geez, I'm afraid not. I think that's a bigger question than we probably would be able to even answer.
Yeah, but even now, like I mean, we know more about dreams than they did then. But still, I would imagine people kind of see it as potentially people returning back to visit them in dreams. Again, just kind of a question I was just thinking too. It's funny how, I mean, this is obviously this grief and this idea of religion is all in their mind. It makes sense. It would come back in dreams in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, historically, there's obviously a lot of record for people taking very concrete decisions or thoughts from dreams, you know, even before Swedenborg and the Swedenbros. And I think for spiritualists, I think dreams obviously do become evident, you know, in a way, if you're visited by someone from the beyond. Whether it's a dream or whether you think of it more as a vision or a premonition, because premonitions are also things that are often tied to spiritualism. You know, famously, Abraham Lincoln is said to have had, you know, a premonition too, actually, I think, of his own death.
Yeah, dreams do that kind of.
Yeah.
Right. One was a dream where he was in the White House and everyone was mourning, and he went downstairs and someone told him the president had died. Another one, though, took place when he was awake and he had looked into a mirror, but his reflection seemed very pale and strange to him. And it was Mary Todd who suggested that should he be elected president, this was a suggestion that his first term he would live out, but he would not survive his second. That may be more anachronistic than historic record, but those are some connections between, you know, whether it's a dream or a waking vision tied to spiritualism.
I mean, I can absolutely see the connection to dreams. I mean, not to like bring it down, but like I lost my father a few months ago, and I regularly still have dreams where like he'll show up or like my phone will be ringing and I'll look at it and I'm like, no, you can't be calling me. You passed away. And, you know, so I think, and I'm sure that's a pretty common experience when you lose someone. I mean, it's buried there in your subconscious. So I think it's very easy to see how you could translate that as someone contacting you from the spirit world if you're kind of used to thinking in that way.
Yeah,
Maybe I should
especially in the
answer
19th century.
nights, like when I'm I should pick up the phone.
Well, if we're ever going to make a toast to someone, let's make a toast to Travis to his father.
Oh, guys,
Cheers.
come on. Well, thank you.
And I propose a second. Did we already toast Noah Brooks?
Yeah,
We already did that? 'Cause
Noah Brooks.
I'll toast that guy.
Yeah,
Season arms, getting bashed in by drums.
yeah.
So I've got some personal questions too, just that have come up, but we got a couple from the audience as well. This one is typical Jake, who has some crazy questions. I don't know if we can answer this one. So Jeff, you'd mentioned Theosophy. Do any of these figures link with Madame Blavatsky?
Yeah, Blavatsky actually, so Theosophy was, at least in part, an effort to kind of refine and reformulate spiritualism. So there's a direct link there. I'm no expert on Theosophy, so I can't really comment too much. I can.
Compared to us, you
passage
are.
from-
So.
What?
Or you surpassed my knowledge.
Yeah, again, I'm quoting Catherine Albanese here. The two chief founders of the Theosophical Society met at a farmhouse in Chittenden, Vermont, where reports of the materialization of spirits drew spiritualists and other curious visitors. Helena P. Blavatsky, world traveler and recent Russian immigrant to the United States, was among them. So was Colonel Henry S. Alcott, corporation lawyer, agricultural expert, and sometime government official. The two struck up an immediate acquaintance, and drawn by their mutual interest in spiritualism and condemnation of what they regarded as its moral indifference and philosophical simplism, became fast friends. In 1875, with William Q. Judge and a group of others, they formed the Theosophical Society in New York, an organization to carry on occult research. She goes on to say, Theosophy in the generic sense means metaphysical speculation regarding the nature of the divine, and thus knowledge was key to the new group. Blavatsky, or HPB as her followers like to call her, led the way in the pursuit of an occult form of knowledge, while Alcott provided organizational leadership. So there was actually a connection there, but I think the commenter is right to suggest that she wasn't a fan, in the sense that there were specific criticisms that she was responding to, but unfortunately more than that I can't really say. I have to do more research. Sorry, Jake.
It sounded good to me.
Yeah.
And I mean, we've talked about the 19th century spiritualism. I mean, we haven't even touched upon the fact that 620 to 700,000 people died during the Civil War too, and what that impact has on it.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, so we can go in all directions from that. I don't even necessarily plan, but what always struck out to me too was towards the end of the war, not necessarily about all those dead, but for the fact that the war was going to be lost. How someone like Robert E. Lee turned to predestination and almost more of a Calvinist look at things, almost going backwards in terms of how people are moving towards. Basically said, I lost the war, but it's not my fault. This was predetermined, basically. I mean, so it's kind of interesting too how people maybe don't always go in the same direction for trying to come to terms with what's going on.
I think that's one of the difficulties of and on both sides of the war, on both sides of many wars, saying that you have the right on your side, you have the might of God on your side, and clearly, regardless of what God is thinking, someone's going to lose the war. But it is, I think you're right, Joe, that there's a thought that at least for a lot of the soldiers, they might believe one thing or the other about the will of God, but at the same time, they're soldiers and they've got to do their jobs too. And it's interesting to me, Jeff, that you pointed out that gentleman who the formerly enslaved man down in New Orleans, who was, it sounds like, doing seances during the war. Is that accurate? Because that's the first time that I'd really thought about. I've thought about people at home doing seances, trying to connect with soldiers that they had lost or other family members they had lost, but I never really thought about during the conduct of the war, soldiers performing seances.
Yeah, I think during the time he was actually serving, I think that the the seance circle meetings probably kind of tapered off for a bit. But
Okay.
beginning in 1858, there are almost 20 years of seance registers that this book was written from. So yeah, presumably there was some overlap there.
Cool.
Yeah,
Fascinating.
Definitely want to check that book out. That sounds fascinating.
it's very interesting. Yeah.
It
And
a
I mean,
little bit reminds me of like Indiana Jones and the Nazis doing their religious studies and explorations and metaphysics and all that. It's interesting.
Travis,
Yeah, definitely.
you that had mentioned that, I mean, it's obviously getting out of the 19th century, but after World War I, there was a spike again in spiritualism.
Yeah, Jeff and I had been kind of discussing that the other night, that there's kind of a rediscovery or kind of a rebirth in a lot of these ideas. You know, it kind of comes out of the trauma of the First World War. And Jeff definitely knows a lot more about that than I do. So
Well, you're kind. I have an interest in Irish folklore, and so my kind of connection there is through the person of W.B. Yeats, arguably, you know, the greatest poet and playwright of Ireland, who in kind of an appendix to a book written by his friend Lady Gregory called Visions and Beliefs in the West of Ireland, Yeats wrote an essay entitled, get this, Swedenborg, Mediums, and the Desolate Places. And this was published in
man.
I'm blanking on the, I think it was in the 1820s, or excuse me, 1920s, but in which he kind of ranges over all of these sort of topics philosophically and theologically that we've been discussing tonight. And Yeats himself believed himself to be a visionary, and he was a member of the Golden Order of the Hermetic Dawn, and in an earlier book that he wrote called The Celtic Twilight, wrote about a spiritual battle that he had between himself and sort of a coven of dark wizards that he met somewhere in Ireland.
Awesome.
And so these influences continue to kind of assert themselves in various forms at different times in Western history. So they're definitely.
I think it's interesting too that, so obviously, as we discussed, spiritualism is still a belief system today and is actually formalized now, you know, more than it has its own, it has tenets, it has its own website, which it did not have in the 1850s.
Right.
But it's interesting to see how it shifted from a very public sphere, you know, concert hall style seances, right? Something that is a bit of a spectacle, a bit of almost a vaudeville show in some of the ways that they're conducted. But then it morphs over time to being something that's done maybe more in private, or is more of an established personal belief system than it is a kind of public sphere popular phenomenon. Because you have people like Harry Houdini, who are trying to disprove these wrappings, and the Davenport brothers and their magical cabinets, you know, and those kinds of things. P.T. Barnum actually publishes a book called Known Humbugs, which is kind of like a Ripley's Believe It or Two Humbugs. It is a book, you know, kind of debunking some of these mystics and people who are, you know, just in Barnum's point of view, ripping people off. So I thought that was really interesting how some of those beliefs are there regardless from the 18th century of being able to interact with the beyond, but the idea that now we don't necessarily think they're going to sit at a table with you and play a banjo, you know?
Yeah. No, those are great
we still have,
points.
like the reality show kind of mediums, and like,
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
you
We
can
have
still go,
psychics.
well, before the pandemic, you could still go to like a community center and see some psychic who cold reads the audience and communicates with the dead. So I mean,
Sure.
I think that aspect of it is still very much alive.
That's true. That may be true. It's just not for like,
Was
it's
it
not
Long
filling up.
Island Psychic or whatever, Long Island Medium, I mean,
Yeah.
the showmanship is still there.
That's
Well,
an excellent point.
There's an interesting tension throughout American history, certainly since the Second Great Awakening, if not before, of a bifurcation between Enlightenment style thinking and the notion of access to the divine or the supernatural or whatever the case may be. And there have been movements that have challenged that bifurcation, like spiritualism itself. But we're so steeped in a Western empiricist, quote unquote scientific worldview, even though many people who claim to hold to such a worldview don't actually know the first thing about how science works.
So that's actually interesting too, because mesmerism, being especially popular in France, there was actually a royal society created to examine the scientific merits of mesmerism and hypnotism and animal magnetism. And the study they concluded was, we can't say it's not worth studying, was kind of their attitude. And in America in 1854, there was a similar petition sent around to petition Congress to create a separate commission to do the same thing for spiritualism, to examine it from a scientific, whatever scientific, what perspective they would have, to examine it from a scientific point of view. Obviously, no such commission was made that I'm aware of, but there were over 13,000 signatures gathered from across the United States that wanted to see this thing actually studied. Is there any kind of uniformity to the responses from the spirits? Is there any way to, disprove these mediums who say that they are, hearing knocks or whatever it is? But you're exactly right that the science of it doesn't always match up with the belief system of it.
Well, that's actually something that I'm extremely interested in, because in the study of belief, science as a way of producing knowledge about the world is itself a belief system. And like any other belief system, it has criteria of validity, ways in which we, I know, ways in which we determine what is acceptable proof or evidence of phenomena in the world. And in science, very famously, a key axiom is the idea that anecdote is not evidence. And that's really relevant now in our era of fake news and conspiracy theory. But there are lots of other areas in life, for better or for worse. I'm not championing alternative facts or anything like that, but there are lots of areas, effective areas in our own lives, where an anecdote actually really is valid as evidence. Think about how much we rely on internet reviews before we make up our mind about a purchase or about a restaurant we want to attend.
As historians, we largely work from anecdote. We work from personal letters, we work from journals, we work from individuals' experiences.
Definitely.
Aside from kind of weird historians that collect demographic data and stuff like that, numbers, but when we as historians want to prove something, we pull personal anecdotes.
Yeah, folklorists as well, of course. And because religions, broadly understood, are making truth claims about the world that so often rely either on purely received knowledge from a religious institution or a religious leader, or else from purely personal experience of the divine or the sacred or the supernatural. Those streams of evidence put it directly at odds with science as another belief system. And throughout, post-Enlightenment history, there have been these attempts to kind of reconcile the two. And spiritualism, I think we could fit into that framework as trying to bridge the gap between religion and science. As we saw when I read from the official website, they define it as the science, philosophy, and religion of continuous life. So there's an explicit attempt to paste those different belief systems into a composite whole. But those of us from kind of a more mainstream experience, non-centric perspective tend to view accounts of personal experience as cockamamie or crazy or other derogatory as a humbug. Yeah, so in saying that, I'm not championing any particular belief system or anything like that. I'm just saying that there are all these different criteria of validity, as scholars call them, and they don't always match up with the scientific worldview.
Right. We will never know for sure if Mary Todd Lincoln saw Willie and Eddie at the foot of her bed. We will never know, and that may be for the best, but as historians, we can study her desire to see him again. We can study
Definitely.
Morning
and as a historian, I might even argue that it doesn't matter if she did or not. If she honestly 100% believed that she did, then that experience was valid to her. And that says something about the past, and it says something about the character and experience of Mary Todd Lincoln.
Yep.
Yeah, I was going to say the exact same thing. Whether she did or not really doesn't matter, because what you can gather from that is, her thoughts on grief, her thoughts on loss, her thoughts on religion too. And I know we're running low on time, but like one thing that completely stands out to me with spiritualism and religious movements, particularly the Second Great Awakening, how it is, Jeff, you mentioned it, how it does become a more egalitarian thing where you're talking about individuals who can't even vote. And they are major players in these huge movements that have so much impact on people's lives.
Yeah.
Where a woman deemed not worthy of a vote can now become a preacher in a lot of ways, like with the Second Great Awakening. And it becomes more of a common person thing, out of doors, breaking down the hierarchy, not just in religion, but also society, and which is also why there's such a pushback, not just for religious reasons, but because of the social upheaval that it causes.
Mm-hmm. And there are, I agree with all of that completely. And folklorists also, in addition to those kinds of views, we also take something I think I might have mentioned in the last time we did this, but an experiential approach to anomalous experience. So that means that rather than trying to look for social or cultural functions and social or cultural causes underlying these experiences, instead we assume that something actually happened, and then we try to sort of, to borrow Anne-Marie, something you said a moment ago, we try to do some detective work and figure out what the nature of that experience was. So, we don't know whether or not Mary Todd actually saw the ghost of her son, but maybe if we assume that she did have some kind of experience, well, we know a lot now about how altered states of consciousness can impact sensory perception. So spiritualism and mesmerism and related traditions put a lot of value on trance states, in which we know factually that the human mind is open to all kinds of non-normative forms of input. So could there have been some kind of, not necessarily supernatural, but perhaps a less visible or measurable kind of experience that she was having that led to a perception of that kind? So yeah, I think you guys are dead on in saying we can never really answer that question when we're dealing with something so distant in time and space from ourselves. But asking the question is a really important step for us to take. What actually happened here?
Well, this has been pretty awesome. I know we can keep going on this. Maybe a third one will come about mesmerism and animal magnetism will come from this episode. Jeff, thanks so much for joining us again.
Oh my God, thank you guys for having me. It's a blast.
Awesome.
Anytime.
Cheers.
I really appreciate you joining us again.
I keep pretending like there's beer in it. There's not any beer in it.
That's all right. We're about to end.
I know, I just finished mine.
So at the Loudoun Museum, again, we've got our next blog come up tomorrow. We're working active with the school districts. Anything, we could do to help keep us posted for Loudoun Museum with educational programs. For History on Tap 2, this whole program came about because of questions and feedback that we got from our folklore one. But for the Mosby Heritage Area, what do you guys have anything coming up you want to promote?
So tomorrow we have live at 5. We'll be talking to Jeb Hannum and Don Yovanovich about the races, being our point to points, our racing history here in Northern Virginia. We also have, of course, coming up next week, our next History on Tap, which, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that's 63 coming up, isn't it?
Yeah.
1863.
Slog our way through the Civil War with 1863 next week.
Wow.
But again, as a reminder, we'll be telling the more obscure stories. So hopefully things that even if you are a Civil War buff, you've never heard of. And if you're not a Civil War buff, you'll still get a kick out of it.
Yeah, and the Mosby Heritage Area Association and the Loudoun Museum, we both got membership programs. If you enjoy the programs that we do, via blogs or virtual ones, sign up, become a member. We really appreciate the support and being a part of our communities too.
You'll be an official member of the Travis Shaw's Banjo Fan Club.
By the time this is all over, hopefully I'll be able to actually play. But yeah, if you're interested in the Mosby Heritage Area, please visit our website, mosbyheritagearea.org. You can find information on memberships. You can find scavenger hunts and tours of the area that you can explore the history of our area without breaking any social distancing rules. And you can also follow along with the upcoming events that we have. So.
Great. Jeff, any parting shots?
Say it again?
Any parting shots for you? I don't know if I interrupted you a minute ago.
No, I actually just saw somebody, Sharon had a question. Isn't there a spirit roaming around at the Loudoun Museum?
Ooh.
Ooh.
There supposedly was, but I'm so boring, they left the museum when I started. Awesome. Again, thanks again, Jeff, for joining us. We really
Thanks,
appreciate
Jeff.
it.
My pleasure. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, bud.
Association, thanks for joining us. And we'll be tuning in next week for 1863 as a crowd.